Good afternoon. Well, as it turns out, not such a perfect day. A real shame in terms of the weather that we have lost a number of the people who were going to be taking part in the conversation today, both in the audience and on the panel. But we're delighted, nevertheless, that everyone can make it who is here. And very important launch for us today of the City Growth Commission, hashtag City Growth, which you will all have got information about in the packs in front of you. Can I just run through a few housekeeping things to start with? Please turn your mobile phones off if any of them are on at the moment. Secondly, a reminder that this event is being recorded and there will be a podcast and an edited video available on the RSA website in the next few days. And we're also live streaming the event. And a reminder, I think, that people can tweet about the event as well if they wish. So, delighted to be joined today by Jim O'Neill, who's going to be chairing the Commission, and I'll introduce him a bit later to talk about the Commission, and John Collins, who's leader of Nottingham City Council and from the Core Cities, who will talk about why the Core Cities are supporting the Commission. We're also hoping to be joined by Alexandra Jones from Centre for Cities, who's going to talk a bit about the public policy context for the City Growth Commission, but she's coming from another event with Bruce Katz, who is also one of the commissioners. There's a number of people in the room who are commissioners, and I'll probably ask them to identify themselves a bit later, and there'll be an opportunity for some of them to take part in the conversation as well. As I said, I've had apologies from most of the core city leaders who weren't able to get to London today, including Richard Lees, who's the chair of the core cities, as well as being leader of Manchester City Council, and was due to be one of our speakers. So I've had apologies from them. I've also had apologies from Councillor Dave Sparks, who's the deputy chair of the LGA, who wanted to be here from the LGA to say why the LGA think this is an important initiative. So delighted that the RSA are hosting the Commission. Some of you may wonder why the RSA and not be familiar with some of the work that the RSA does. The RSA, in addition to its 26,000 fellows and its fellowship programme, has a large research programme and a large education programme. So the RSA sponsors, for instance, 2 academy schools, runs a big education programme, has an entrepreneurship programme, and does a lot of work in public services. And as Chair of Public Services at the RSA, Alex, delighted you could join us. I'm very pleased that we're supporting this Commission. And it ties in very much with some work that we did 2 or 3 years ago when we ran something called the 2020 Public Services Commission that was chaired by Sir Andrew Foster. And one of the key recommendations of that commission was that we needed to decentralise decision-making over the running of public services, that if we wanted to have more efficient public services, then which were better able to cope with the long-term demand pressures that public services were going to face, then we ought to find ways in which the power over the running of those services could be decentralised. And actually that will be one of the themes that I think we're likely to explore in the work of the Commission, because one of the key questions for the Commission is about the relationship between public service reform and economic growth. And again, that's one of the issues that may well be touched on by some of the panel later on. And a key underpinning question there is about how cities can not only grow and contribute to the national economy, but also be financially sustainable. A lot of the work that's been done by core cities and other organisations has illustrated the extent to which, at the moment, much of local government, much of our cities are in a position where more public expenditure is spent in those places than the level of GVA that those cities are creating. And that's, in the long term, not a sustainable position, and not a position that the cities themselves want. They want to be able to have more power over the way in which they coordinate their services so that they can make their places not only more prosperous, but also more sustainable. And I think that we're launching this Commission at a fortuitous time, because it does seem to be that for the first time probably in a decade or so, there's much more rhetoric in public policy about the need to decentralise political and economic power. However, I think it's fair to say that so far the actual scope of that and the pace of that has not been that impressive. But there is at least an interest and an intent in that direction. And that's why I think it's really important that part of the work of our Commission is to think about what a future government post-2015 could do if it was really serious about empowering our cities. One of the key issues that we want to explore. And the process that we're going to be going through over the next 9 to 12 months is, first of all, a call for evidence, and all of you should have in your pack today a call for evidence, and we'll be very keen for a range of different organisations, business organisations, local government organisations, think tanks, academia and others, to submit evidence to us about what they think are the key opportunities to address some of the questions that we set out in that call for evidence. And we'll also be holding evidence sessions where organisations can submit their evidence to us and be cross-examined in terms of some of their key ideas. We're also going to be commissioning research into some of the key questions that we want to identify, and we're going to be engaging with policymakers and practitioners through a range of round tables, looking at some of the specific issues, barriers and mechanisms that we may want to explore when we get into the Commission at a later stage. So, delighted you can all come. As I say, very keen that you all take part in the Commission process that we're launching, which will be very much a process in which we're seeking to engage wide opinion. And can I now introduce Jim O'Neill, who is the chair of the Commission. Many of you may have heard him on the Today programme this morning, and he had an article in the Financial Times today as well. And Jim, I think, is going to set out why he's agreed to chair the Commission and what he hopes to get from it.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Good afternoon. I'm just going to make 6 different points to put the context of this ambitious project into the way I sort of think about the world and life. So I shall be brief and leave plenty of time for my colleagues and for all of you to say things you may want to do as well. So first of all, I'd like to thank Ben and the RSA for, I guess, your boldness and imagination in coming up with this idea of the RSA funding such a purposeful group. And indeed for having, I hope, the wisdom of asking me to chair it. It is very important that I also say in that regard, it's a great feeling and honour that we've managed to put together such a rich as well as diverse and deep group of other commissioners, of which I see at least 3 of them here, maybe some others dotted around. I don't think so. So half of the current announced commissioners are present with us today, and I'm sure when it comes to Q&A with their areas of speciality and beyond, we will drag you into it, guys, if you weren't warned in advance. Second thing to say on the back of that, and being a proud Mancunian, and as I said on the Today programme this morning, at least in my position on the Commission as the chair, I don't think we should deceive ourselves about the scale of some of the issues that are relevant here. Certainly for most of my lifetime, the seemingly ever-ending rise of London relative and the South East to the rest of the country has gone in one direction. And as an observer and as a trained economist in some of the issues that relate to this, there are considerable underlying long-term reasons that perhaps drive that. I also want to say in that regard that there is no intention to diminish the importance of London at all in that context. As some of you probably know, I've often described London as the brick capital of the world, and it seems to me London is spectacularly placed so long as our national and other policymakers don't do too many crazy things to continue to be a ever-rising important centre of this complex modern world. And the intention of the Commission is not to subtract from that, but to explore some issues, many of which Ben touched on, to see whether we can help stimulate the virtuous circle juices that could lead to other urban areas, perhaps not only doing a lot better for themselves, but critically helping to raise the overall national economic performance of the country, which I got into a bit more in the FT piece this morning. Third thing to say is it sort of comes more to me. Obviously, the past, I guess it's now 12 years or so, I've become known as sort of Mr. Brick. It'll be on my tombstone. And at the core of why that whole thesis has become so well known is two basic, simple, long-term issues. That to be economically large, you need to have a lot of people working, and they need to be productive. And whether it's in China or India or many other parts of the developing world or developed world, it is obviously in that regard no coincidence that the main generators of economic activity are urban areas. And so some of the issues are very critical to what's going on elsewhere in the world, but we can focus more on them ourselves to help our own growth become more sustainable, in my judgment. Fourthly, in that spirit, and also relating to the second point about the scale of the challenge, I think there's often a view here in this country, and maybe in some others, that the relative decline of some regions, especially urban ones, and ones that may be related to being past manufacturing sectors, are things that are just irreversible and there's nothing you can do about it. And again, I emphasize that the scale of issues that relate to it are not to be underestimated, but there are, in my opinion, quite a few examples of cities in some parts of the world where they have. When I was first learning about economics at school in the early 70s, I specialized in economic geography at the time, and there was a strong view prevailing that Boston and New England was an area that had been written off. And Bruce, I'm sure it's something you've looked into a great deal, and I don't know how many people here have spent much time in Boston the past 20 years or so, but that is certainly not a place to be written off in the slightest. It's an incredibly vibrant and dynamic place. Closer to home, Hamburg in Germany is one of the most rapidly expanding urban areas, and I think the first place I ever traveled on a train as a mischievous student was on Interrail going through Hamburg, where it was also written off. But today I think I'm right in saying it's one of the most rapidly expanding urban areas in Europe. So there are just two examples, I'm sure of which, Greg, there are many others that exhibit those tendencies. Fifthly, linked to that, and I think going to the core of at least where I'd like to influence the work of the Commission and how we judge some of the evidence we get, and linking about past regional initiatives, I think we want to focus a lot more on what you might broadly call, from an economics perspective, supply-side issues as opposed to demand issues. Many regional strategies in the UK have focused on special tax incentives and doing things to try to persuade or coerce or force industry X or Y to go to location A or B, whereas what I think is perhaps evidenced by some of the examples I've said, at Boston perhaps in particular, is doing things about the supply side of an urban area are probably, as difficult as they may be to pull off, things that are going to be more likely to be ultimately successful. So certainly a lot of things to do with local infrastructure, and we will be focusing, I hope, not just on physical infrastructure in that sense, also technological infrastructure, which is obviously especially important for the youth of today and their future, but also things to do with the flexibility and the skill base and the education capabilities and attainments and desires of people too. And I think we'll probably spend quite a lot of time, at least between us, discussing those kind of issues and, as I say, looking for what some of the good ideas in terms of evidence suggest. And then finally, and touched on by Ben, it seems to me that there is a case for saying that some, if not all, regions or urban areas should be given more autonomy or thought of autonomy in terms of their own financing. having thought about some of this just from a Manchester perspective on some of the work I've done with Richard and Sir Howard and his team, and Mike Emmett sitting there, it's the whole notion of whether, in fact, local authority bonds should be resurrected as a form of financing to allow local authorities to make bolder choices about the kind of things they may want to finance for their area, rather than having it dictated to from central governments, and it would fit well with at least one part of the current coalition's philosophy on life, that's for sure. So I shall stop there and to give you a flavour of how I'm thinking about this, and obviously given the richness and the depth of the people on the Commission, it may well be that I get dragged off into a completely different space than what I've just said, but there you go. So thank you again very much.
John, can I invite you to talk a bit about why the core cities see this Commission as being important?
Okay, certainly, and thanks very much. I suppose start by saying it's great to have the opportunity to say a few words. Great, although a little startling, in that since I'm the only one of the core cities leaders left standing today after the transport disruption, you were going to have the views and opinions of Richard Leese. Instead, you've got a few thoughts from me. But the reason why Core Cities is very keen to support the Cities Growth Commission is on a number of different levels, really. I mean, to start with, there's the clear recognition that actually cities are the engines of economic growth in this country. And that is all cities, but as an organisation that represents the 8 largest cities outside of London, our agenda is certainly one of looking to rebalance the national economy, and rebalance the national economy by recognising the roles that the core cities can take. And you know, it is the case that almost uniquely in Europe, the big cities outside of the capital underperform the national average performance, economic performance in this country. Elsewhere in Europe, those regional cities, those big cities, either perform at or above the national economic average. And, you know, that's a challenge not just for the core cities themselves, but actually it's a challenge for the national economy. And, you know, when you look at the continued growth and rapid growth of London, and then you contrast that with the recession and perhaps what we're beginning to see now as sluggish growth elsewhere across the country. It doesn't take too much to project forward and to think that actually what is seen as a benefit in London now may well become increasingly a challenge. And as policy develops to address what will become a challenge with the London economy, that in itself will cause difficulties in the regions and particularly in the big cities. And yet the core cities collectively have, in terms of GBA, generate more growth than London does. So 27% of the national economy is attributable to growth in the core cities. And in fact, interestingly, if you looked at the performance of the core cities, and if that performance in economic terms simply matched the national average, you'd be looking at an additional contribution to the national economy of some £1.3 billion. And so our argument, our contention is that actually the core cities can do a good deal more. The core cities have potential for growth, and in growing would be able to rebalance the national economy. Oxford Economics have done work for core cities, and in that they've shown that by 2030 there is the potential through growth in the core cities to generate an extra £224 billion pounds of GVA and an extra 1.15 million jobs. But it won't happen in the current the current policy framework, it won't happen while the position of the core cities is one of total or very large dependence on national government, national policy and national funding. The core cities collectively retain about 5% of the tax take that is generated locally. Now, that's not to say we don't get a good chunk of what the government collects or what we hand over to government back, and we do. But of course, as it comes back with strings, or it comes back through a variety of other agencies to be spent locally, and often spent against national frameworks and through national agencies that, however well they're run, however sensitive they try to be, can't understand that local variation, local need, local difference, which could far better be addressed with an increasing level of devolution and an increasing focus on the needs and expectations of local communities, local people and local business. And our contention is that greater devolution, in some sense around powers, but in particular around finance, the ability for us to keep and use in a more discretionary way the tax take locally, would allow us to better address local need, better promote local growth, and actually to encourage a greater contribution to the national economy. So that's really the reason why Core Cities is very keen to support the Cities Growth Commission. It's not about, the core cities against London. It's not about the core cities instead of other cities. It's not about the core cities as opposed to other parts of the economy. It's just that there is a clear recognition on the part of core cities that we can do more, that we actually want to do more. With greater flexibility and with greater devolution, we could do a lot more, and we could do a lot more to drive economic growth and growth in a more balanced way across the UK.
And Alex, as Director of Centre for Cities, you've studied this issue more than most. What would you say are the kind of policy challenges that you think the Commission needs to address?
Indeed, and I should apologise for being late. The reason I was late is I was just at another Cities event, because I can't get enough of them, with Bruce Katz, who I think is speaking here a little later in the week, and I'd recommend to anyone who doubts how important cities are to economic growth and to innovation, go to the talk at the RSA, I think there's a waiting list now, or read the book, because I think it makes the case very powerfully for the things that we're sitting here talking about. So, policy challenges. I think very briefly on the context, it's very clear from the evidence, and we've looked at this a great deal since we were set up in 2005 as the only think tank dedicated to understanding and improving UK city economies. The evidence is clear that cities are driving the global economy. Because economies are more and more dominated by services, by knowledge, what matters is to businesses, they need access to customers, they need access to skilled labour, and they need access to ideas. And that's what cities offer around the world. It's no accident that it's predicted 70% of the world's population will be urban by 2015. And for those who predicted that the rise of technology would mean the world would be flat, I think they forgot that the reason it's become as ubiquitous as it has is people working in Silicon Valley, a place, creating ideas, innovations, and spreading them out. In the UK, this is true as well. The evidence shows our cities drive the economy. The 64 largest cities account for around 60% of the jobs of the GVA, 3/4 of the knowledge-intensive, the most highly skilled jobs. But it's also true that the contribution, as has been said, varies significantly. If you look at the 9 largest English cities, as has been said, they account for over half of English GVA. If you look at some of the fastest growing smaller cities like Milton Keynes and Brighton, they've grown well above the national average in recent years. And at the same time, you've got cities like Hull, which have been struggling for decades to rise to the challenges of quite a rapidly changing economy. We also have a situation in the UK where, despite the fact that cities do drive growth, we have, with these 9 largest English cities, as was said, 7 out of those 9 performing below the national average. Now, in a world where cities are driving economic growth, that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable now, and if you look 10 years in the future, it means the UK is going to fall behind. So, 3 policy challenges I'd identified. There are many more, but you don't want me to speak forever. And I think many of these have been touched on already, actually. The first one is, in an economy which is all about innovation and networks and connections and people working together, we continue to be one of the most centralised countries in the world. So if you look at some of the kind of tax-raising powers, for example, there's lots of figures on this. One of them, local areas in the UK raise on average about 17% of their money. I've seen lower figures than that. Across the OECD, it's on average more than half. And actually, there's an awful lot of lack of control over that money. As John said, it's actually very difficult to be able to decide how you spend your budgets if you're a city. And so many policies are national, and one size fits all, even when they're about places. Housing is a great example of this. Absolutely, we have a national housing shortage. But if you look at places, there's London, there's the South East, have major issues. Other places around the country too, but in Burnley, they don't need new houses. They don't want new houses. They want replacement, they want refurbishment, and they want to be able to take their own decisions about how they spend the money, because otherwise, national money is wasted following national schemes. It doesn't help those people. It doesn't drive the economy. So I think one of the big challenges for the Commission, I know you know all of this, is actually trying to kind of break through that way of thinking about things and get people thinking about what would this look like if we had a different kind of way of doing things where cities are able to spend their own money, because actually we have to do this in an era of the second challenge I'm going to highlight. So if the first challenge is about shifting that balance from national to local, the second is the era of austerity that we live in. We know that public spending needs to be reduced over the years ahead. We know that cities can't rely on national government for grants, which historically has been how things have had to operate, whether you wanted to or not. We need to find ways to reduce spending and to do more. And I think one of the interesting examples of how you can really do that comes out of things like community budgets. In Manchester, for example, the money saved, 10 million in cashable savings, when you work together on troubled families, joining services up. It's also true to say that of that money, about 2/3 of the money was invested by local partners. 80% of the savings went straight back to Whitehall. So you've got an era in which there's a lot of austerity. We need to save money. Places can do that because they can join things up around people. They can actually respond to what's going on in their economy. But we need to change the structures that enable cities to benefit from some of those investments and make sure that they can reinvest some of that money, not all of it, but some of that money into the local economy. And I think the third challenge, and again this has been mentioned, is the need to strengthen the second tier and the other cities. We have to make the most of London. It's a global city. It is thriving, it's got an international reputation, it creates a lot of opportunities for the UK. What we also need to do, though, is to make sure that the other cities are complementing it, that they have investment to increase their scale, their impact. So you've got the Manchesters and the Leeds of this world able to respond to the needs of their economy, invest in the infrastructure they need. So actually London and Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield and all those major cities, as well as the smaller cities, are able to work together to make the economy thrive. At the moment, it doesn't work like that. And you can see the impact in London, congestion, some of the challenges around housing. We need to make far more of the talents and skills of the cities around the country. So those are just 3 of the challenges we see for the Commission that I think you're already trying to address. And I think I'd very much agree with your emphasis on the supply side. I mean, at the Centre for Cities, we are trying to kind of raise demand for ideas about this. Not enough people, I think, buy the argument that cities are part of the answer to the national questions that people are asking about welfare, about immigration, about jobs. We're launching a campaign called Think Cities, and we'll be working, we hope, with Ben and with the Commission to make sure that it's complementary. We'll also continue our work on business, on labour markets, infrastructure, leadership, finance, because those are the things that make urban economies tick. And I think you'll be touching on many of those in the work that you do. So for the Commission, it would be great to see you changing the terms of the debate. It'd be great to see you establishing some of the benefits of city-driven economic growth rather than this national focus, and reviewing the way in which labour markets operate at the local level, understanding not just about how to align national decisions with local decisions, but actually about how local labour markets work differently and then connect to make up the national economy. This isn't a national economy made up of local. This is an economy that's all about local labour markets that drive economic growth. And I'm sure you'll make a fantastic contribution to that debate, and we look forward to working with you.
Thanks, Alex. So a range of challenges and questions I think have been set out. And what I think we'd really like to hear is what you think about that. So it'd be interesting to get your reflections, any questions you have, any comments you have over the next 15 to 20 minutes. So can I see an indication of who'd like to come in, and then I think there's a roving mic that will take people around. Okay? So there's one there. Do it in that order. One there to start with. Okay? If you could say your name as well, please.
Yep, Jonathan Schiffers from the RSA. I'm channeling a question from Twitter, and if anyone wants to tweet questions, spread the word on that. The question is, should we simply take the bold step and move government out of London?
Okay. Who's next?
My name is James Bethel. My question is about the government's current big supply-side bet on rebalancing the economy, which is a big train called high-speed rail. And Jim, I heard you on the radio this morning. I completely understand why you might be reluctant to have this commission dragged into a very passionate debate about high-speed rail, but it is the biggest thing the government is doing at the moment in this area. And it seems to me a little bit sort of disingenuous to completely avoid the question of whether that's going to achieve any impact or not. And I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about what your instincts are about what the impact of such a big infrastructure project might be.
I think we predicted probably that question would come up, but
Told you.
yeah, you did. I'll take two or three more, and then we'll come back on it.
Thank you. Mark Griffiths. I'm really interested in this idea of gross domestic happiness. And really, Jim, with your economics background, whether you think that's a valid criteria potentially for cities to look at in the development of the future.
Who else would like to come in? Over there. Right. Yeah.
Hi, Toby Harris. I'm pleased that the debate isn't being couched simply as London versus the other cities, because I think there's a real issue within London to the extent to which the growth that is being generated at the moment is unsustainable, because so many people in London are not benefiting from that, and the divisions within London are being made even greater. But I think the task of the Commission is going to be to sell the importance, as you clearly have identified, of cities. I'm concerned that national politics is too dominated by the needs of rural communities. Take the rural broadband debate. If you choose to live in the back of beyond, why on earth should you expect the same quality of broadband connection as everyone else? I mean, it's that sort of misplaced egalitarianism which is failing to recognise that in the long term, the economic future of the country has got to be the sort of vibrant cities that are generating growth and that might ultimately enable you to deliver that broadband to the rest of the country.
It's a great rallying cry for cities.
I'm Councillor Caroline Eden from Hammersmith and Fulham, and many of the people living in the heart of the city are finding that much of the development in our borough is being occupied by people who neither live nor work in the city and who are buying property within the city, which is not being economically productive and contributing to the economic life. And I wondered if that issue would be being addressed by your Commission.
Anyone else at this stage? Yeah, on there.
Ben Cochan. My question relates to actually the issue of different kinds of cities, and quite clearly, you know, we've had a speaker here who's represented the core cities group, which are the larger cities, but actually arguably the problems are with the smaller cities. Alex mentioned Hull, but there are loads of others which are facing much bigger challenges, and I wondered if how you're going to look at those as well as these large, what would be called the large drivers.
Okay, shall I suggest we come back at this stage and then see if there are more questions? I don't know how we're going to do this. Jim, do you want to take maybe a couple of questions and then...
Yeah, I'll just...
I don't think you need to respond to each of them.
rattle away on the bits I think I have any vague capability of answering. I should say at the outset that when I decided to leave my famous previous life, I decided that if what I was going to do has to be, if not better, different. And looking at some of these questions, they certainly satisfy that criteria, along with a couple of other things I've chose to do, which, importantly, one of which, especially education, is very parallel to some of our aims. So government out of London, I'll leave that to others other than to say that I suppose some might regard that as a supply-side initiative, but I don't really see that as... If that was what happened, I wouldn't see it as a vindication of us being successful on this commission. I think there'd be deeper things than wherever the location of our government should be. On the HS2 and rebalancing the economy, Kel Surprise. One of our commissioners, Tony Travers here, has a sort of most eloquent way of summarising my own views on it, and I might ask Tony to say that. But my own view, and we are going to discuss it because of the reasons you said, and we will. It won't dominate what we do, but obviously we do, for the reasons you said, have to have a view on it. But my own view, for what it's worth, is that, as Tony would articulate better than I say, if that's the money that is available for this project and for nothing else, then maybe it isn't a bad thing. But as an economist that looks at things in terms of relative choices, I can see the case, and I think the case and analysis of it should be done in these terms as to if that money is available for anything, are there better uses or not? But that is not the purpose of this commission, but we will certainly be having some discussions around it. And then just a couple of other things that were thrown at me. On the very interesting topic of happiness, and especially as it relates to cities, and I'd link it a little bit to these two questions over here. I spend quite a bit of time in my old native city, and I know it is true here in London that if you just hang out in the absolute centre, it all can often seem glistening and beautiful, and there are lots of people in the inner urban areas that none of this seems to really touch in their lives, which I think the lady from Hammersmith pointed that out. I suspect it's true in many of our cities, and we will be looking at things to try and change that. To make it more inclusive for those people, and they are part of it. Which, if we did that, then I think that would contribute a bit more to happiness. That said, and here I am afraid far too much of an economist, I think they're probably, wealth as opposed to size is a very different thing, and it seems to me that you can do things about wealth, and that is probably not a bad proxy for this weird subjective thing known as happiness, would be all I would say on it at this stage. I shall leave the other questions to other people more qualified. And Tony, you may want to articulate further on...
And I think
HS2.
It's also, I think, fair to say that on behalf of the Commission that clearly one of the first things we will need to discuss is what we mean by cities.
I meant to say that, so yes. We will, in our very first discussion, come up with as good a way as we can as defining what we mean as a city, and we will certainly consider going beyond core cities, that is for sure, for the reasons that were pointed out.
And actually there was quite an interesting exchange between Eben Davis and you this morning, mentioning Henry Overman's work about agglomeration effects and the relative importance of size in terms of cities and so on. That's clearly one of the things that I think we need to get into. John or Alex, would you like to come back on any of the questions?
Well, 2 or 3 actually. HS2. So core cities are totally in favour of HS2 and do believe that it will be an important economic driver for growth. What I find interesting in this debate is that actually we have the debate looking at it through the eyes of and with an economic perspective of 2013 when the thing ain't going to be running until 2032, 2034. I think the circumstances will be so different that actually we will need the additional capacity. I know that's the government's new line, but actually we will need the additional capacity. But over and above that, actually, while if you look at the speed difference between existing train services and HS2 within the context of how quick does it take you to get to London, you might come to the conclusion that it's not that big an improvement. Actually, when you look at the speed difference between the core cities, it's a massive improvement. It takes 2 hours to get to Leeds from Nottingham. I can drive there quicker than that. It takes 2 hours to get from Nottingham to Manchester. It takes 1 hour and 20 to get from Nottingham to Birmingham on the train. It takes 1 hour to get to Sheffield. Those times will be slashed by HS2, absolutely decimated. And those are very significant, and significant in the context of the argument that we're making, which is that you have to rebalance the national economy. And, there is a sense in which this debate is happening in the capital that doesn't want HS2 because it really wants to spend the money that will be spent on HS2 on Crossrail 2. And we understand that. From a perspective of the Labour leader of a Labour City Council, amongst other Labour leaders of other core city Labour councils, I have to say that there is a great deal of disappointment with the equivocation and the lack of clarity that's coming out of the front bench on this matter, and that is something that we are most disappointed about. In terms of the point about unequal growth, even within London, I'd just like to say I totally support the point that Toby Harris is making, in that we can see that sense of overheating from outside of London, and actually it's not something we want to repeat, but actually more even growth elsewhere in the country will ease the pressure on London, will make it better for people who live in London and who do business in London. We actually have the situation now, and this is at a particular level, but we're beginning to see developers coming to talk to us in the core cities because as UK investors and UK investment funds, they're being outcompeted by Middle Eastern investors and Chinese investors and Indian investors for property development in London. So they're now beginning to look elsewhere. And that is the kind of speculative development that you're concerned about in Hammersmith and Fulham. So that can't be good for our economy. And my final point is slightly flippantly about the rural question. All I would say is, again, I think Toby Harris is entirely right. There is a sense of kind of spurious equality at times on these kind of issues. I have to say, there are, and Tony Travers suggested this the last time I saw him, but actually there is a sense in which the big urban areas can do something for the suburbs and rural areas, and that is that we can grow and we can help those areas avoid urban sprawl and avoid the kind of development that they don't want to see. I have to say, though, there is a sense in which, when you talk about how ugly windmills are and, you don't want a turbine in your back garden, there's a bit of me that thinks, the rest of us are actually subsidising putting the power lines out towards your house in the middle of nowhere. Maybe your contribution is to put up with it as a contribution to putting energy back into the national grid that helps keep our bills down. So, hey, but that's me being a bit unreasonable, I'm sure.
I'll be brief, but I would completely agree with that point about cities and rural areas. If you look at cities, we define cities not just as the heart of a city, but actually as the travel to work area. That completely includes many rural areas that are utterly dependent on cities for work and for some of the income. And I think so. I think it's often a kind of a false difference that you put up between cities and rural areas. Actually, rural areas are part of and dependent on cities in many instances. But it's also important to remember, if you look at deprivation, say, 82% of the most deprived areas are in the 64 biggest cities. And it goes up if you look at the most deprived. So if you're looking at where the people are and where the concentrations of deprivation are, it's a strong argument to keep spending in cities. They're also 10% more productive. You're 17% more carbon efficient if you're in a city. There's a lot of reasons to keep spending in cities, but I suppose you wouldn't expect any other answer from this panel. other 2 points I wanted to make. The point about the smaller cities. There are challenges facing cities all around the country. I think one of the things that I'm sure the Commissioner will be looking at is the relationship between different kinds of cities. So, for example, Manchester and Oldham, and the relationship there. And Oldham fully recognises that its future is absolutely tied up with that of Manchester. So the fortunes of that city are about Manchester and the Greater Manchester area in a different way to Hull, for example, which is slightly more geographically isolated. So I think one of the things that we need to avoid in this is oversimplification, which I know the Commission will. It's about making sure you make the most of the big areas and actually make more of the scale, connecting them up. That's about infrastructure. That's about skills. It's about making the most of some of the smaller areas like Brighton and Milton Keynes that actually are part of the London economy. You could argue. They don't always like me arguing that, but that's what the evidence suggests to a great degree. It's about tailoring things to different places and not having what we always have, which is a one-size-fits-all approach to cities, or then to big cities and smaller cities. The cities have different types of potential. You can do more or less with them. We need to respond to that. And that means about different approaches and understanding the relationships between cities and what is a very small country. And my final point would be about the Hammersmith point. I think one of the really interesting things about the London housing debate recently, which is the spiralling house prices and the complaints about people who invest here but don't live here. I think that actually underlines the importance of the London Finance Commission, which I was on, which Tony chaired, some of the recommendations in that, because actually the biggest challenge is that people who live in very big houses don't pay very high property taxes to reinvest in the city. Now, if we could get to something like that, not just in London, but in other major cities, so you do get that investment, that would start to be cities able to invest in themselves and the infrastructure and the things that they know they need. That would make a big difference.
Thanks, Alex. Well, Jim may have been on the Today programme, but I think you'll have gathered from our answers that we're unlikely to be on the Archers. Any other questions? On there and at the back over there.
Thank you, Chairman. Terence Bendixson, Research Fellow, University of Southampton. Jim, sorry to come back to HS2, Chairman, but it's not going to put you on the spot. Jim Steer, when he was making the case for HS2 about 10 years ago, had a set of slides, 15, 20, something like that, and probably the most arresting of them was a graphic presentation of VAT registrations across substantial towns and cities throughout England. He showed a bird's eye view of VAT registrations rendered as a little set of bars for city after city. And what was noticeable was that the cities in the south had lots and lots of VAT registrations. As you went further north, there were fewer and fewer and fewer of them. Now, VAT registrations are a surrogate for innovation, for business innovation. May I urge you to look very carefully at that data and think very hard about it. And may I also urge you, and Chairman, I understood you to be an economic geographer, please use graphics. Graphics, graphics, graphics. Don't give us page after page of words. We'll never manage to read them. Please give us graphics. Have a graphic designer on your commission from the word go to help pick out those things that you can express clearly and beautifully in graphics. Thank you.
Questions?
Noted.
There? And there.
On the subject of graphics, will the map of the cities extend across to Europe? I'm thinking particularly in terms of the infrastructure, because I know that Amsterdam, for example, services 23 UK cities, which is, I think, more than Heathrow and Gatwick put together. So in terms of the scope of the solutions and recommendations that come out of the Commission.
Question at the end there.
Joe Randall from the Institute for Government. We at the Institute are primarily concerned with the workings of central government. And to us, the recent history of efforts to decentralise from the centre show that the lack of decentralisation isn't about a lack of passionate or well-reasoned demands, but really more thought needs to be given to why reforms that have been proposed fail to deliver what they initially promise. We're currently doing a piece of work on why the problems at the centre, how the problems at the centre are overcome. But I think what's really key for the Commission is to have a very credible plan for managing the different groups' interests that are involved in any effort to decentralise. And making good points about the need for decentralisation is unlikely to be sufficient to actually achieving long-term reform.
Another question over
there. Richard Johnson from Public Finance magazine. It's been mentioned that there's been a number of sort of developments in this area, including the London Finance Commission that Tony Travels was chaired on. I'm just wondering whether that kind of impacts on the starting point of the Commission, where the focus perhaps in terms of taxation is going to go. Is property taxes one area where you think the debate has already been made, or is that an area where you're going to focus? What's the beginning, given the work that's already been done?
Question there. And then two in the middle, and then I think we'll need to call it a day after that.
Scott Kane, I'm the Startup Director for the Future Cities Catapult, which is a technology and innovation centre. So a question for Jim. You alluded to technology earlier, and we have some insights. I suppose we're up for sharing those insights with you, having run a competition for UK cities to bid for £24 million to join up the services of their city more effectively, which Glasgow scooped. So I guess, firstly, I'm interested in how you're planning on pulling through ideas around technology. And then secondly, something that, as the Catapult Centre that we're focusing on is this idea that if you join up the services of a city, and if you try to integrate at the level of finance, at the level of technology, at the level of bottom-up citizen engagement, you can both unlock new economic activity and you can deliver savings. And so I'm interested in, I guess, how you're going to tap into that world of technology that's out there to help you think about how services can be delivered in different ways.
Okay, a couple of people who wanted to raise questions in the middle there.
Adam Hart from Hackney Cooperative Development. Following on from the last question, around the whole take that we need to be focusing on the supply side, I think this engenders something of a bit of a change in thinking in classical economics, not least what the Manchester economics students have been complaining about. There's a whole field of economic anthropology which has got very, very reputable origins stretching back the last 100 years, which is largely ignored, I think, by this level of discussion, but I think are vitally important when we come to a whole agenda of unleashing local energies. Richard Florida has spoken considerably about it, and Poliani and Castells. Would the Commission take this seriously, please?
Okay, and final question, I think.
Hi, Oscar Rodriguez. I'm an architect. I specialise in building integrated agriculture. I'd like to know what you plan to do in terms of the design of cities. Following on from Scott's question, technology, design, it seems that you're centering on governance and finance, which is obviously the support structure, but design, do you envisage, together with graphics as well, there's enormous amounts of excess capacity in cities that is not realised, be it human, be it physical. My particular concentration is on roofscapes, for example. So design.
Okay, thanks. Interesting range of questions from geography to technology to design and finance. Do you want to pick up again?
Yeah, I'll pick up on a few. Some of them connect, but link to this and aspects of that. I'll start with a slightly, perhaps, strange thing from overseas. As I say at other events that focus on different topics, South Korea is possibly the most interesting, reasonably large populated economy of my professional lifetime. Why? Is because the only nation of more than 40 million people that has seen its wealth go from an African country to that of close to a G7 country today. It's the only one. There are probably a number of reasons why that is the case. Almost definitely at the core of why it's managed that in the past 20 years is because on technology-related stuff, it is the best in the world, better than for its people. And whether it's the issue about the rural community or how you bring the best out of cities, particularly modern cities, I think there's quite a bit to be learned of making sure that you try to make sure the best technologies not just mobile signals, but including those, are available to as many of your people as you can get, and particularly true with internet servers and things that relate to that. And I certainly will be trying to emphasize that. And in that context, I was a little bit reluctant to avoid specific names, but we have a guy called Rohan Silva, who is part of our commission, that, amongst other things, works as an advisor to the current Prime Minister, and is, I think Rohan is not here, is part of sort of the exciting things going over on at Old Street. So very, very much part of that. Linked to issues about design, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but I'm sure we'll get into it. With young people, there are some signs, as the younger people here probably know, and some of the design people, that the next generation of urban dwellers are showing signs of losing their love affair with the automobile, for example, and the use of technology is part of that. And of course, if we don't look at things like that, I think it would be very remiss of us, which means that maybe we gave you, or I gave you the wrong impression. You know, the ability to have more influence on their financing is certainly something, but no, these issues very much part of what we would like to do. And then the only other thing to mention, apart from noting the recommendations about graphics, etc., and even though I said I was studying economic geography, I don't see myself as just an economic geographer, I hasten to add, but there you go. So, some people that have worked for me the past 30 years might just think that I am. I can identify countries with lots of people. But I don't think we're going to be looking specifically at the issues for other cities in other countries, but certainly the bit from what you said that I think is really important is the ability for cities to have connectivity with the rest of the world is obviously very much something in which we do. Going back to my life from BRICS, and Mike's heard, and Greg have heard me say this times, I think it is no fluke that you can get to quite a large number of cities non-stop from a number of German cities. And that is no fluke as to why Germany is doing so well with them. And I'm sure that it'll be part of what we do.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the thing about decentralisation, or maybe just by way of a quip. I mean, you can get all over the world from East Midlands Airport near Nottingham, but you have to be a package as opposed to a passenger. But, you know, I suppose my perspective on the issue around, you know, why has decentralisation failed, and, you know, and this is just my perspective, but I think it comes down to fragmentation of funding. So, you know, in my time as a councillor, local agencies have been fragmented. So, you know, local authorities have less and less influence directly and have to spend a huge and disproportionate amount of time trying to get that influence by being nice to people, essentially. It's a good policy anyway, but sometimes a bit of carrot and stick works reasonably well, rather than, you know, having to be all carrot. And you know, our experience is, you know, we're now losing any influence we have over schools. You know, we have little influence over the health service, but actually the one area where the opposite has been true has been on public health, and I just think that that's quite instructive, because as a local authority, we're now responsible for public health. We were anticipating getting some £23 million from the health service across by way of funding. We reckoned we could run the service on around £20 million. And actually, we ended up getting £27 million, and we still think we can run the service on around £20 million. And I say that, and not just run the service, but actually run it better in that. You know, we were both commissioning the same people to do roughly the same kind of services. We were both doing similar kinds of promotion work. And I use that as an illustration because, you know, there are other areas where actually bringing things together, you know, doing the opposite of seeing through further fragmentation, but actually bringing things together will make a huge difference. So, for example, on the work programme, it's a, you know, it's not been well, actually it's difficult to know whether it's been a success or failure because, of course, all of the performance data is commercial and in confidence, so nobody ever gets told whether it's, whatever the outputs are. But, most of the big cities run similar kinds of programs and are getting, 20, 30, sometimes 40% of youngsters into sustainable work as a result of it. And I don't think that's a performance that the work, don't know, but I don't think that's a performance the work program's managing. You could look beyond that. I could see a role whereby locally you could combine spending around welfare. The government's going through a major welfare reform program, which I think is probably going to collapse. But you could look at ways in which locally you could bring together welfare and welfare spending alongside the work, the work that we do, getting people into jobs, alongside, the benefits that we administer, alongside housing, and you could look at a creative way relevant to local needs and local norms and understandings, which helped you far more effectively encourage people to get into work and to get out of the poverty trap. And to meet their own personal needs, and do it in a way that was perhaps far more flexible and effective than we currently have. So, in terms of policy solutions, I think greater devolution would see us with some much better, more effective policy solutions, but perhaps crucially at a time, when government's cutting back massively and local authorities are having to make significant savings, actually you could look at ways of doing things better, more cheaply and more effectively.
Alex?
Very briefly, on the VAT registrations point, one of the great things is the Commission is starting from all the work that's been done, and we actually published something a few months ago that looked at VAT registrations in 64 cities around the country. So that's the kind of thing that we'll be sharing, and there's a great deal of detail on that. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of work you can use. On the central government point, I wouldn't agree that there is plenty of demand for decentralisation. That's not my experience. It's talked about. I think city deals have been fantastic. It's been relatively isolated. I think they found it hard to get the momentum. And actually, I think you can see the evidence in things like housing policy, etc., where you just don't have a sense of place. And I think decentralisation is partly about pushing things down, but it's also about just thinking about places in the first place, to think about where do you push things down. And I don't see that as much as I think we should have, certainly amongst politicians and civil servants, and that's understandable because who wants to give power away? Where I do completely agree with you is understanding more about the barriers and why reforms have failed, and making sure that we're not just making good points in the debate. And I'm sure, again, the Commission fully recognises that and is going to deal with it, because actually this is partly about the political case. It's partly about demonstrating what will happen, and it's understanding why again and again do we fail to get the financial join-up that would actually work well. There's evidence it would work well at a local level. Why does that keep failing to happen? Why do all the accounting officer innovations not quite work? What is it that's happening? One explanation I heard in Whitehall was they don't have the capacity to devolve. But I think that raises some really interesting questions about the big shift it would require in systems and ways of thinking and culture to actually just make sure that cities can do some of their own things and respond better to local circumstances. So there'll be plenty of answers, but I think you're absolutely right, that would be key for the Commission.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the panel. I think we've established that there's a lot for us to talk about and get our teeth into. And you haven't escaped, as it were, by leaving today without us expecting more from you, which is that what we'd like from you and others who can't be here is for you to submit evidence to the Commission as part of the work that we'll be doing on a whole range of the different subjects that we've been discussing and others that we weren't able to get into today. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks also to the Mayor of London, to London councils and core cities for supporting the Commission. And I hope that you're all able to be involved in the work that we're going to be doing over the next 9 to 12 months. Thanks.